History is often written in ink and blood, but there are chapters written in white milk and silent tears shared in the shadows. We often hear of great kings, emperors who conquered continents, but rarely does anyone speak of the breast that nursed them into greatness. Within the gilded palaces of medieval Europe, or the mysterious harems of the Ottoman Empire, there existed a silent force, African women with ebony skin and fierce vitality, brought in for a single purpose: to become royal wet nurses. They were chosen for their sweet milk, for the resilient physique nature bestowed upon them, but the price they paid was survival amidst a pack of power-hungry wolves. They did not just breastfeed, they had to taste poison. They did not just lull babies to sleep, they had to stay awake to watch for daggers in the dark. This is not merely a story of nurturing, it is an epic of survival, of a sacred maternal bond given to a child, not of their blood, and of how black women silently protected dynasties upon their slender shoulders. If you wish to understand the true power of sacrifice, stay with us, hit like, subscribe, and leave your thoughts on the role of women in history. The journey begins now. The selection of destiny under the scorching sun of the dark continent. The fate of young women sometimes lay not in their hands, but in their breasts filled with the essence of life. In centuries past, when Western medicine or royal remedies could not solve the high mortality rate of royal infants, the eyes of recruiters turned toward Africa. They believed that black women carried the primal strength of Mother Earth, that their milk was thicker, richer in nutrients, and capable of immunity against the ailments that plagued the frail aristocracy. Was it a privilege or a curse? It was hard to distinguish clearly in that moment. Women who had just given birth, the pain of labor still fresh, the joy of holding their own flesh and blood still incomplete, were torn away from their biological children. The heart-wrenching cries of the babies left behind in their homeland blended with the desert winds, becoming a haunting memory that would cling to them for a lifetime. They were taken onto ships, crossing oceans or traversing endless roads to reach magnificent palaces, where the scent of incense mingled with the metallic stench of political intrigue. No one asked if they wanted to go. History did not record their voices, only the urgent need of a dynasty, requiring a healthy heir. They entered a selection process more rigorous than the choosing of concubines. Elderly royal physicians scrutinized every strand of hair, every tooth, tasting the milk to ensure absolute purity. In the eyes of the nobility at that time, they were both precious biological instruments and exotic creatures to be controlled. But hidden deep within the sorrowful eyes of these bereaved mothers was a fierce flame of survival. They understood that to survive, and perhaps one day return, or simply to soothe the ache of missing their own children, they had to pour all their love into the stranger's child about to be placed in their arms. That was the beginning of a paradoxical journey, nursing another's child to preserve one's own life. Stepping into the quagmire of the harem, where love is sometimes the deadliest, weakness. Crossing the threshold of the imperial palace was akin to stepping into a different realm of existence, one where the air itself seemed to weigh heavier, burdened by centuries of secrets and the metallic tang of unbridled ambition. For the woman who had only known the vast, open skies of her homeland or the rhythmic, chaotic pulse of the village, the sheer verticality of the palace walls felt like a stone embrace that promised safety but delivered suffocation. As the heavy iron gates groaned shut behind her, sealing out the world she understood, she realized that she had not merely entered a building, but a living, breathing organism that fed on silence and obedience. The architecture was designed to dwarf the human spirit, with soaring arches and marble floors so polished they reflected the fear in her eyes. Yet to her, this magnificence was cold, sterile, and utterly devoid of the warmth of the earth she was used to treading upon. She was led through labyrinthine corridors where shadows danced under the flickering torchlight, each turn revealing more opulence yet deepening her sense of isolation. The silence here was not the peaceful quiet of the savannah at dusk, but a heavy, expectant silence, pregnant with the whispers of unseen observers. She could feel the weight of 1,000 invisible eyes upon her, glances that were not welcoming but assessing, dissecting her worth as if she were a prize mare brought to market. In the eyes of the courtiers, and the ladies-in-waiting who rustled past in their stiff silks, she was an anomaly, a dark silhouette against the pale limestone, a vessel of raw, untamed life brought into a place governed by rigid, stifling etiquette. They looked at her not as a woman with a history, a name, or a grieving heart, but as a biological necessity, a distinct and exotic instrument procured to sustain the lineage that their own frail bodies could not support. The grandeur of the surroundings, with tapestries weaving tales of conquest and gold leaf peeling from the cornices, only served to highlight her own insignificance in this grand theater of power. She was a guest who was also a prisoner, a savior who was also a servant. Survival in this environment began not with physical defense, but with the psychological fortification of the soul against the crushing loneliness of the crowd. She quickly learned that the palace was a place of paradoxes, where the most beautiful flowers often concealed the deadliest thorns, and where a smile could be a prelude to a dismissal or worse. The air smelled of rosewater and decay, a cloying sweetness meant to mask the stench of betrayal that seemed to seep from the very walls. She was given chambers that were more luxurious than any dwelling she had ever known. Yet the softness of the featherbed offered no comfort to a body aching for the familiar hardness of home. Here, she was scrubbed, perfumed, and dressed in fabrics that felt alien against her skin, a ritual of purification that felt more like an erasure of her identity. As she sat by the narrow window, watching the moon rise over a foreign garden where not even the trees grew wild, she understood that to survive the golden cage, she would have to lock her memories deep inside a fortress within her heart, inaccessible to those who sought to own her body and her milk. When the bundle of silk and lace was finally placed into her waiting arms, the geopolitical weight of the empire vanished, replaced by the universal, undeniable gravity of a newborn's need. It was a moment of profound and jarring intimacy, a collision of two worlds that had no business touching, yet here they were, skin against skin, breath against breath. The infant, the future sovereign, the bearer of titles too long to recite, was in this moment nothing more than a hungry, whimpering creature, seeking the only thing that mattered: sustenance. As she looked down at the pale, fragile face, so different from the deep, rich tones of her own child left thousands of miles away, a complex storm of emotions surged within her chest: grief, resentment, but overwhelmingly, a visceral, instinctive tenderness that bypassed all logic. The baby did not know he was a prince. He did not know she was a stranger taken from a distant land. He knew only the scent of milk and the rhythm of a heartbeat that sounded just like the one he had heard in the womb. The act of nursing became a silent rebellion against the rigid structures that separated them. As the child latched on, drawing the white life force from her dark body, the boundaries of caste, race, and destiny dissolved into the simple, sacred transaction of survival. It was a biological irony that the most powerful bloodline in the land, the dynasty that claimed divine right to rule, was now utterly dependent on the biological resources of a woman they considered beneath them. Her milk, formed from her own sorrow and resilience, was now building the bones of the king, knitting together the flesh that would one day wear the crown. In the quiet of the nursery, away from the prying eyes of the court and the cold judgment of the physicians, a bond began to form, not of servitude, but of shared humanity. She became his universe, her arms the only borders he knew, her voice the only law he obeyed in the stillness of the night. Yet, this connection was fraught with a painful duality, for every time she looked into the eyes of the royal infant, she saw the ghost of her own child. The phantom weight of the baby she had been forced to abandon pressed against her chest, a phantom pain that throbbed with every swallow the prince took. She was pouring her life into this stranger's child, giving him the strength that should have belonged to her own flesh and blood. It was a sacrifice of the highest order, a sublimation of maternal love that required a strength far greater than that needed to wield a sword. She realized then that she was not merely a wet nurse. She was a conduit of life, transmuting her own loss into the future of a nation that would never fully acknowledge her. In the darkness, as the prince slept, sated and safe against her bosom, she whispered songs of her homeland to him, embedding the rhythms of Africa into the dreams of a European monarch, a secret heritage that he would carry in his blood, unknowingly, for the rest of his days. To exist within the palace walls was to learn a new language, one not spoken with tongues, but with the darting of eyes and the subtle shifting of silks. The wet nurse, initially an outsider deaf to the intricacies of court politics, soon found herself immersed in a suffocating atmosphere where silence was never truly empty. The corridors she walked, cradling the future of the dynasty, were alive with the rustle of conspiracy, a ceaseless hum of ambition that vibrated through the stone floors. She realized quickly that the palace was less a home and more a battlefield, where the weapons were rumors and the casualties were reputations and lives. As a woman of no rank, a shadow in the corner of the nursery, she became invisible to the highborn ladies and scheming ministers who spoke freely in her presence, assuming her ignorance or indifference, but she was listening. She absorbed the intricate genealogy of the shifting alliances between the queen's chambers and the concubines' quarters, understanding that the child at her breast was not merely a baby, but a pawn on a chessboard she could barely comprehend. The danger was not always overt. Often, it came wrapped in the guise of concern or flattery. The biological mother, perhaps a queen burdened by protocol, or a favorite concubine stripped of her maternal rights, would look upon the wet nurse with a gaze that was a terrifying mixture of gratitude and venomous jealousy. How could she not hate the woman who held her child, who knew the rhythm of his breathing better than she did? This resentment festered in the damp corners of the harem, breeding a toxic environment where every gift could be a trap and every smile a prelude to betrayal. The wet nurse learned to navigate this treacherous terrain with the instinct of a prey animal. Sensing the shift in atmospheric pressure before the storm broke, she understood that her position was precarious. She was essential yet expendable, a temporary vessel for the royal heir's life force. To survive the web of whispers, she had to become a vault of secrets, locking away what she heard, never betraying her awareness. For in a place built on deception, the truth was often the quickest route to the grave. The transition from the pentalogical warfare of whispers to the visceral reality of physical threat came not with the clash of steel, but with a scent. In the grand dining halls and the private nurseries, death did not always arrive in the form of an assassin. It often wore the mask of sustenance. The wet nurse, whose senses were sharpened by the primal need to protect the life dependent on her, began to perceive the world through a filter of paranoia. Every bowl of broth, every goblet of water, every sweetmeat offered to the growing infant or to herself became a potential vessel of doom. She discovered that in the struggle for succession, a pinch of tasteless powder was far more effective than an army. The air in the nursery, once smelling only of milk and lavender, now carried the phantom stench of arsenic and hemlock, odors that perhaps only she, with her heightened maternal instincts, could detect. It was a terrifying realization that the very act of nourishment could be weaponized. Her role shifted dramatically. She was no longer just a source of food, but the first line of defense, a biological shield standing between the innocent heir and the malice of his own kin. A cold, steely resolve settled in her heart as she realized that to poison the child, they might first try to poison the source. She began to scrutinize her own meals with the eye of an alchemist, rejecting anything that looked tampered with, eating only what she saw prepared or what she could trust, which was precious little. The burden of this vigilance was crushing. Sleep became a series of fitful naps, her hand always resting near the cradle, her body a coiled spring ready to snap at the slightest disturbance. She watched the child's complexion daily, looking for the telltale pallor of slow intoxication, her heart skipping a beat at every cough or whimper. In this deadly game, her body was the filter, her health the canary in the coal mine, and she accepted this terrifying duty with a stoic grace, knowing that the survival of the small, helpless life in her arms depended entirely on her ability to smell the poison before it ever touched his lips. The role of the wet nurse evolved into something far more macabre than mere sustenance. She became the biological filter for a dynasty under siege. In a world where a drop of hemlock could alter the course of history, the simple act of eating transformed into a daily game of Russian roulette. Before the silver spoon could touch the royal infant's lips, or before she herself could consume the meals necessary to produce the life-giving milk, she had to become the first line of defense. It was a cruel and terrifying intimacy with death, forcing her to treat every chalice of water and every morsel of bread as a potential assassin. She learned to detect the subtle metallic temps of arsenic hidden in sweet pastries, the faint almond-like scent of cyanide masking itself in the aroma of stone fruits. Her body, once celebrated solely for its fertility and strength, was now a disposable shield, a vessel that absorbed the risks intended for the king to be. There were days when a sudden wave of nausea or a sharp cramp in her stomach would send a jolt of panic through her veins, not for her own life, but for fear that the poison might seep into her milk and harm the child she had grown to love with a fierce, protective desperation. This silent duty required a stoic resignation that few could comprehend. She ate with the solemnity of a condemned prisoner, her eyes scanning the faces of the servants who brought the trays, searching for a flicker of guilt or nervousness. Every meal was a solitary interrogation of the senses, If she fell ill, she knew she would be discarded and replaced, or worse, accused of the very treachery she was trying to prevent. The physical toll was immense, but the psychological burden was heavier than knowledge that her survival was inextricably linked to the continued purity of her body, which was no longer her own. She was a living laboratory, a human litmus test, walking the razor's edge between nourishment and demise. Yet, in this terrifying vulnerability, she found a strange kind of power. She was the gatekeeper of the future king's health. Without her, the fragile infant would be at the mercy of a court that smiled with daggers behind its back. She swallowed her fear along with the food, digesting the terror so that the child could drink only peace. When the sun dipped below the horizon and the heavy velvet curtains were drawn against the chill of the night, the palace transformed from a bustling theater of politics into a cavernous tomb of shadows. It was in these long stretching hours that the wet nurse felt the true weight of her exile. While the court slept or plotted behind closed doors, she remained the vigil keeper, the sentinel in the nursery where the silence was so profound it hummed in her ears. The flickering candlelight cast long, dancing shapes against the stone walls, turning familiar furniture into looming specters, mirroring the unease in her soul. Sleep was a luxury she could rarely afford, for the night was when the spirits of her past came to visit. In the quiet, the cries of the royal infant sometimes morphed into the phantom cries of her own child, left thousands of miles away across oceans and deserts. The longing was a physical ache, a hollow space in her chest that no amount of royal luxury could fill. She would sit for hours by the cradle, rocking the future monarch, humming the lullabies of her ancestors' melodies, woven with the rhythms of the savannah, songs that spoke of rivers, red earth, and the spirits of the wind. These songs were her only tether to the identity she was forced to shed at the palace gates. In the darkness, the hierarchy of the day dissolved. There was no king and no servant, only a woman and a child, two fragile lives drifting in the vast, cold ocean of the palace. She poured her grief into the silence, whispering secrets to the sleeping prince that he would never remember, but perhaps always feel stories of a land where the sun kissed the earth with fire, where freedom was as natural as breathing. The night was her confessional and her prison. She watched the rise and fall of the baby's chest, counting each breath as a victory against the darkness, knowing that when dawn broke, she would have to armor herself once again. But for now, in the solitude of the forbidden palace, she was just a mother grieving the child she lost while saving the child she held. The nursery was not merely a sanctuary of innocence, it was a contested territory where a silent, bitter war was waged over the body of the future king. The wet nurse found herself standing alone against a phalanx of royal physicians, head midwives, and elderly matrons who viewed her presence as a necessary evil, a primitive vessel to be tolerated but never respected. These were the keepers of tradition, men and women clad in stiff robes who wielded their authority like a bludgeon, armed with cold instruments and archaic medical texts that held no warmth for a living, breathing child. They looked upon her dark skin and the intuitive, rhythmic way she soothed the infant with suspicion, regarding her ancient ancestral wisdom as savagery that needed to be tamed. Every time she cradled the prince against her skin to calm his colic, or hummed a low, vibrating tune to settle his fever, she felt the piercing glares of those who believed that a future monarch should be raised with distance and rigid discipline, not with the wild affection of a stranger. It became a battle of instincts against protocols. The physicians would prescribe bleedings or harsh purgatives for the slightest ailment, their faces masks of detached professionalism, while she, driven by a fierce, protective maternal logic, would fight to simply hold him, to let the natural heat of her body and the purity of her milk heal what their cold science could not. She saw the child not as a specimen of royalty to be managed, but as a fragile life that craved touch and comfort, things that palace etiquette deemed beneath a king's dignity. This ideological clash turned the nursery into a stifling arena where she had to navigate the jealousy of the other wet nurses, women who had been rejected or whose milk had dried up, and the arrogance of the doctors who feared that her success would expose their incompetence. She learned to assert her dominance not through words, which they would not hear, but through the undeniable evidence of the child's blooming health, a silent victory that only deepened their resentment. In this war of the midwives, she was an army of one, armed only with the timeless power of nurturing, standing firm against a system that sought to strip the humanity from the very boy born to rule it, the abstract dangers of poison and politics. eventually coalesced into a terrifying moment of visceral violence, shattering the fragile peace of the royal sanctuary. It happened on a night when the unrest outside the palace walls finally breached the gilded gates. The roar of a rebellion, or perhaps a coup d'état, echoing through the marble corridors like the approach of a thunderstorm, as the sounds of clashing steel and screams drew closer, turning the opulent halls into a slaughterhouse. The palace guards panicked, their loyalty crumbling in the face of imminent death. In the chaos, the wet nurse did not think of fleeing. Her universe had narrowed down to the small, terrified bundle in the crib. While courtiers scrambled to save their jewels and their own skins, she instinctively scooped up the future king, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs, and sought the darkest corner of the room. There was no weapon in her hand, no armor on her body. She had only her flesh and bone to offer against the cold steel of the assassins. She curled herself around the infant, transforming her body into a human cocoon, a living shield designed to absorb the blows meant for the dynasty. Every muscle was tense, anticipating the searing pain of a blade. Her breath held tight in her lungs as heavy boots kicked open the nursery doors. In that eternity of seconds, huddled in the shadows, she realized the profound irony of her existence. She, a woman stolen from her home, treated as a commodity, was now the only barrier between the empire's future and its annihilation. The assassins, blinded by bloodlust, or perhaps missing the dark shape in the corner, passed them by, their fury directed at the empty crib. She remained frozen long after the footsteps faded, the child's muffled whimpers buried in her bosom, her tears mingling with the sweat of terror. She had not just fed the king, she had bought his life with her willingness to die, a sacrifice that no chronicle would ever fully record, leaving her trembling in the aftermath, holding the weight of a crown she would never wear. Asterisk, as the seasons turned, and the infant grew into a child, and the child into a young sovereign, the wet nurse's role underwent a profound metamorphosis. She was no longer the vessel of sustenance, for the prince had long been weaned. Yet her presence in the palace remained as constant and grounding as the foundation stones themselves. In a court teeming with sycophants, ambitious ministers, and distant relatives vying for favor, she occupied a unique, undefined spacious shadow that held the ear of the sun. The bond forged in the quiet terror of the nursery, cemented by the shared rhythm of heartbeat and breath, had evolved into a fortress of trust that no political alliance could replicate. To the growing king, the throne was a cold, lonely seat of judgment, a place where every word was weighed and every gesture scrutinized. But the chambers of his old nurse were a sanctuary of absolute truth. Here, stripped of his heavy robes and heavier titles, he was simply the boy she had raised, the life she had shielded with her own body. This influence was subtle, a soft power that flowed not from decrees or armies, but from the deepest wells of human connection. She became the quiet conscience behind the throne, the voice that whispered of mercy when the council demanded blood, the memory of hunger and vulnerability that checked the arrogance of absolute power. When he looked at her, he did not see a servant or a foreigner. He saw the only face that had looked upon him with unconditional love before he understood the concept of kingship. The courtiers, initially dismissive of the savage woman, began to realize with growing unease that the road to the king's heart ran through her. She did not wield this power with the bluster of a politician. She wielded it with the patience of a mother. She taught him to listen to the silence between words, to see the suffering in the eyes of the common folk that mirrored the suffering in her own, embedding a strain of empathy in his rule that was alien to the rigid protocols of the empire. Her power was invisible, pervasive, and to the established order, deeply dangerous, for she was a reminder that the king was human first, and divine second. The ascent of the wet nurse from a silent biological utility to a pillar of moral authority did not go unnoticed, and in the venomous ecosystem of the palace, visibility was often a precursor to destruction. As the young king turned to her more frequently for counsel, bypassing the grand viziers and ignoring the icy stares of the queen mother, the simmering resentment in the court boiled over into a calculated rage. It was an intolerable insult to the aristocracy that a woman of her complexion, a commoner with no lineage, should hold such sway over the destiny of the realm. The whispers that had once been merely disdainful now turned malignant, weaving a net of conspiracy designed to strangle her influence once and for all. They could not attack the king directly, nor could they easily dismiss a woman he regarded with such filial piety, so they aimed to destroy her character, to taint the very source of her power. Accusations began to seep from the dark corners of the harem, like noxious gas rumors of witchcraft, of dark arts practiced in the dead of night, of her manipulating the king's mind with potions disguised as herbal remedies. They exploited her foreignness, twisting her cultural heritage, her songs, and her prayers into evidence of malevolence. The jealousy was no longer about her position. It was an existential struggle for the soul of the court. Every kindness she showed was reinterpreted as manipulation. Every private audience with the king was painted as a seduction of his will. The trap was set with terrifying precision, leveraging the superstitions of the age and the insecurities of those who felt their own power waning. She felt the change in the atmosphere, a tightening of the noose that was far colder than the assassin's steel she had faced years ago. This was a war of reputation, where the enemy smiled to her face while sharpening the knives of scandal behind her back. She stood at the precipice, knowing that her love for the king had become her greatest liability, and that the higher she rose in his esteem, the deeper the grave her enemies were digging for her. Amidst the rigid geometry of court etiquette and the icy calculus of power, the wet nurse carved out a secret curriculum for the young prince, one not found in the royal scrolls or military treatises. While his tutors lectured him on the divine right of kings, the intricacies of tax law, and the art of war, she taught him the forgotten language of the heart. In the quiet interludes between state lessons, she would weave stories from her homeland fables, of trickster spiders who outwitted lions, of kings who lost their crowns because they forgot the names of their servants, and of the profound African philosophy that a person is a person through other people. These were not merely bedtime stories. They were subversive lessons in empathy, planted deep within the fertile soil of his developing conscience. She showed him that true strength lay not in the ability to command an army, but in the capacity to feel the hunger of the peasant and the fear of the soldier. She became his moral compass in a world that often rewarded cruelty. When he witnessed the casual brutality of the guards or the indifference of the nobles, she would gently guide his gaze to the humanity of the victims, reminding him that beneath the rags and the dirt, blood flowed just as red as his own. She taught him to listen to the wind, to respect the cycles of nature, and to understand that a ruler who destroys his land eventually destroys himself. These lessons were a silent rebellion against the dehumanizing machinery of the empire. She knew she could not change the laws of the kingdom, but she could shape the soul of the man who would one day enforce them. It was a dangerous education, for a compassionate king is often seen as a weak one by the wolves at court. Yet she persisted, driven by the hope that the milk she had given him carried with it not just nutrients, but the spiritual resilience of her ancestors, a legacy of survival and dignity that would one day temper the cold steel of the throne. The day the heavy golden crown was finally lowered onto his brow, the air in the capital vibrated with the roar of thousands, a cacophony of bells and cannons that shook the very foundations of the earth. For the wet nurse, standing obscured in the deep shadows of the cathedral's vast nave, the spectacle was a kaleidoscope of blinding light and crushing sorrow. She watched the child she had rocked through feverish nights, the boy whose tears she had dried with her rough hands, transformed before her eyes into a distant, gilded idol. The robes of state, heavy with velvet and ermine, seemed to swallow his human form, encasing him in a layer of majesty that separated him from the world and from her forever. As the archbishop intoned the ancient Latin rites, sealing his fate as God's anointed on earth, she felt a physical severing of the invisible cord that had bound them together since his first breath. Tears streamed silently down her face, unnoticed by the ecstatic crowd. They were tears of immense pride, for, against all odds, against poison and politics, her son had survived to take his place in history. But they were also tears of profound loss. She saw the stiffening of his jaw, the mask of stoic impassivity slipping over his features. The boy who had once laughed at her folktales was gone, replaced by the king. In the thunderous applause that followed, she realized her task was complete. She had been the bridge over which he walked to reach this height, and now, like all bridges once crossed, she was left behind on the other bank. The grandeur of the coronation was a funeral for their intimacy. As he turned to face his subjects, raising the scepter high, she whispered a final blessing in her mother tongue, a prayer for his soul in the lonely, cold altitude of power, before turning to fade back into the darkness of the palace that was no longer a home, but a monument to her sacrifice. Time, the great leveler, eventually turned the fierce protector into a fragile relic of a bygone era. The wet nurse, whose body had once been the solitary fortress standing between a dynasty and its extinction, now found herself adrift in the quiet backwaters of the palace she had haunted for decades. Her hair, once the color of midnight, was now frosted with the winter of age, and the strong arms that had shielded a future king were now withered like dry branches. She lived in a small, comfortable chamber allocated to her by royal decree or kindness, perhaps, or a convenient way to hide the living evidence of the king's humble nurturing. She was no longer the vigilance in the nursery or the silent power behind the throne. She was a ghost in the corridors, a figure whom the younger servants whispered about but never truly spoke to. The court had moved on, consumed by new wars, new alliances, and new births, leaving her stranded on an island of memory. The isolation of her twilight years was profound. Though surrounded by the tapestries and gold of the empire, her spirit wandered back to the red earth of her homeland, to the village she had been stolen from half a lifetime ago. The luxurious silks of the palace felt heavy and cold against her skin, a constant reminder that she had spent her life warming the blood of strangers, while her own kin remained a distant, aching void. She would sit for hours in the palace gardens, her milky eyes tracing the flight of birds that knew no borders, wondering if the wind that rustled the cypress trees had also touched the baobabs of her birth. She was a mother without children, a grandmother without a lineage to hold, her biological legacy severed so that the royal line could flourish. It was a cruel paradox. She was revered in abstract as the king's nurse, yet personally forgotten, a breathing monument to a sacrifice that no one wished to examine too closely. In the silence of her room, she spoke to the shadows in her native tongue, terrified that if she stopped, the language of her ancestors would die with her, erased by the foreign words she had been forced to adopt. When death finally came for her, it did not arrive with the pomp and circumstance of state funerals, nor with the weeping of nations. It came quietly, like an old friend entering an unlocked door, finding her still waiting in the pre-dawn light. The passing of the woman whose milk had built the bones of the monarch was marked only by a brief ripple in the daily routine of the palesa, hushed conversation among the chamberlains, a modest shroud, and a burial in a corner of the royal crypt reserved for faithful servants. There were no statues erected in the town square, no chroniclers dipping their quills to record her philosophy or her struggles. To the scribes writing the official histories, she was a footnote, a biological necessity mentioned only in passing, if at all. The books would praise the king's strength, his wisdom, his resilience in the face of adversity, never acknowledging that these virtues were nurtured at the breast of a woman who had lost everything to give him life. But true history is not always written in ink. Sometimes it is written in blood and spirit. Her legacy did not vanish into the earth with her bones. It lived on in the mercy the king showed to a defeated enemy, a mercy born of the empathy she had whispered into his ear. It lived on in the way he withstood the poisons of the court, protected by the immunity her body had forged for him. The black history of this dynasty was not visible in the portraits hanging in the gallery, but it flowed silently in the veins of the ruler, an invisible current of African resilience that had altered the genetic and spiritual destiny of a European empire. She was the root of the great oak, buried deep underground, unseen and unacknowledged, yet without which the tree would have withered and fallen. As the heavy stone was rolled over her grave, sealing her story into the silence of the ages, the truth remained. She was the unseen front line, the warrior who fought with no sword, the mother who gave the world a king while the world forgot her name. Her journey had ended, but the echo of her life would resonate in every beat of the king's heart, a secret drumbeat of survival that death itself could not silence.